As 1975 began, the series of political scandals we know as Watergate came to the end of another and perhaps final chapter. The verdict handed down on New Year's Day seemed to resolve the events that began with the breaking and entering of Democratic Party offices in June 1972, the apparent attempts to cover up the break-in, the revelation that many of the president's conversations about this and other matters had been taped, and the prolonged legal battle over the use of those tapes as evidence. Throughout 1973, the Watergate hearings had been almost daily television fare, as well as newspaper headlines. And the ramifications of corruption in high places will keep historians busy for years to come. In 1973, we had seen a vice president resign and a new one appointed. John Mitchell, John Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman, and Maurice Stans were facing trial, and some 50 other presidential aides were awaiting indictment or already in jail. And as the president celebrated his 61st birthday in January of 1974, his troubles were, if possible, deepening. Internal Revenue was threatening to investigate his past returns. The Watergate Committee was considering political favors allegedly granted to ITT and the dairy industry. The Justice Department was presenting evidence which could implicate him in the Watergate cover-up. And the House Judiciary Committee was considering the most drastic of measures, impeachment. And Richard Nixon's oldest friends, the public, seemed to be deserting him. A Roper poll released the first week of the year said 45% of the nation was in favor of impeachment, 44% against it. This division was reflected in Washington. Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia, felt this way.
I would hope that if the House does impeach, and I'm not taking any position on impeachment because that's a matter for the House to determine. I don't advocate it, but I do say this, that if the House should impeach, then I think that the president ought to seriously consider resigning in order to spare the country the travail of going through a Senate trial, which would be very detrimental to the business of this country. The executive branch, the legislative branch, would be virtually slowed to a halt, and I don't think that the country can stand this kind of slowdown.
But in his State of the Union address, the president seemed ready to take on the challenge of impeachment.
Like every member of the House and Senate assembled here tonight, I was elected to the office that I hold. And I want you to know that I have no intention whatever of ever walking away from the job that the people elected me to do for the people of the United States. And I want to indicate on this occasion that I will cooperate with the Judiciary Committee in this investigation. I will cooperate so that it can conclude its investigation, make its decision, and I will cooperate in any way that I consider consistent with my responsibilities to the office of the presidency of the United States.
The president gave the IRS its tax information, but others investigating him had considerable difficulty getting the cooperation he had promised. The Watergate Committee, which had subpoenaed a number of tapes of White House conversations, received a letter from the president explaining his reasons for refusing to hand them over. Sam Dash, chief counsel for the committee.
All I can say is that we've received no cooperation recently from the White House. We've not received any of the documents that we asked for. We've not received any of the tapes.
The few tapes the president had given the committee were suspect, because an 18-and-a-half-minute gap had been found in the fateful tape of June 20th, 1972, when the president had been recorded discussing ways of dealing with the break-in with his closest assistant, H.R. Haldeman. Stephen Bull, a presidential aide, was asked how the tape had been erased.
I have no idea, but I know I did not erase it. My conviction is that it was accidental.
How could that have been?
I don't know. I'm not a tape expert, sir.
Senator Daniel Inouye, a committee member.
There must be some explanation, and I would hope that it is not just a sinister force.
The Senate Watergate Committee asked the special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, to investigate the erasure. He, in turn, called on the FBI. Rosemary Woods, the president's secretary, appeared in court to testify at her lawyer's request.
I told them I'll come back 1,000 times if they want me to. I have only one story to tell.
What is that
And I've
story?
told it a dozen times, and you've read it that many times, too.
Her story was that she might have accidentally touched a foot switch which erased the tape as she spoke on a phone several feet away. Later, a panel of experts would testify that the tape had been erased repeatedly and deliberately. The prosecutor's overall investigation into the cover-up plodded forward, and a conflict arose around the limited amount of evidence that was available. There was a fear that its disclosure in the course of congressional inquiries could prejudice future criminal trials. For that reason, Leon Jaworski was reluctant to give the Senate Watergate Committee or the House Judiciary Committee what evidence he had managed to get from the White House. He asked the Senate committee to delay its report until his cases came to trial. Senator Lowell Weicker responded for the committee.
Quite frankly, we've acceded to Mr. Jaworski's request while at the same time making it clear that the committee is there and that no fact will be swept under the rug.
Later in February, the committee also decided not to hold further hearings. On February 12th, the president and his wife discussed his upcoming medical examination with reporters at a dinner party.
They expect to find nothing, and so I'll get it done within about an hour and be out.
But these people tonight said, "Oh, your husband looks great." And I said, "Well, why shouldn't he? I'm taking care of him." Right?
Yeah.
The following day, the president's doctor reported him in excellent health. But pressures for his impeachment grew. Labor leader George Meany.
I think the machinists have done a real good job. They sent a very comprehensive questionnaire out. It went to 1 out of every 50 of their members, which is pretty good coverage. And their questionnaire shows, and combining two questions, should Mr. Nixon resign for the good of the country? That's 49%. Should he be impeached? 23%. So that adds up to 72.2%. And I'm sure that reflects the thinking of our membership generally, not just of the machinist union.
Senator George McGovern, who had lost to Nixon in the election 15 months earlier.
Mr. Nixon has told us that beyond partisan considerations, he wants the presidency to survive. No one can disagree with that expression. But what he chooses to ignore, and what many of us have not yet been willing to assert, is that Mr. Nixon's soiled administration is now the chief threat to the presidency. And unless Congress can soon clear the skies of the clouds swirling around the White House, both the presidency and the Congress will be lost in the gathering storm.
The House of Representatives voted to give its Judiciary Committee full inquiry powers. The committee's legal staff, headed by the hard-working John Doerr, concluded that specific criminality was not necessary for impeachment. But Nixon disagreed and withheld evidence that might prove criminality. There was a question of whether the hearing should be televised. Senator Edmund Muskie, a Democrat from Maine.
Oh, sure, there'd be those who are long-winded by nature who would still be long-winded on television and might tend to abuse it. But I've got an idea, that we're learning as politicians that when the public has a chance to look at us closely, the public is pretty perceptive, and it can separate the phonies, from the real thing.
A ranking Republican member of the committee, Representative Edward Hutchinson, felt people were tired of Watergate.
Do you think the American people would rather watch soap operas than the public business of impeaching the president?
Apparently they would.
The president seemed optimistic about the impending impeachment inquiry.
I do not expect to be impeached.
On March 1st, a federal grand jury in Washington indicted 7 principals in the cover-up of the Watergate burglary. John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, Kenneth Parkinson, Robert Mardian, Gordon Strawn, John Ehrlichman, and Charles Colson all pleaded innocent before Judge John Sirica. In another court, Ehrlichman and Colson were also indicted, along with 3 others, for conspiring to violate the civil rights of Daniel Ellsberg's former psychiatrist by breaking into his office. The grand jury also asked Judge John Sirica to give the evidence that led to the indictments to the House Judiciary Committee for their use in the impeachment inquiry. The judge complied, but on the condition that the evidence concerning Nixon's possible involvement remained sealed until the indicted cover-up conspirators were tried. The White House position was expressed by the president's lawyer, James St. Clair.
As I told the judge, the president's authorized me to report to the court that he is prepared to and instructed me to deliver everything to the House committee that he has given to the special prosecutor for transmission to the grand jury.
Judiciary Committee members were not satisfied with just that evidence. Representative Tom Railsback, an Illinois Republican.
If our counsel advises us that we need more material, I'm certainly going to support the issuance of a subpoena.
Father Robert Drinan, a Democrat from Massachusetts.
It's not up to the president or to his lawyer to say what is an impeachable offense. Furthermore, they had the arrogance to say that the Judiciary Committee must first come to their conclusion that an impeachable offense requires a crime before we can proceed. Third, they said that they have decided that they will give us everything that they gave to the Watergate Committee to Mr. Jaworski, and that should be more than sufficient for the impeachment inquiry. They are not going to establish the parameters of the inquiry that under the Constitution the House and the House alone can make.
On March 19th, Senator James Buckley from New York, who many felt spoke for conservatives, suggested that Nixon resign. A report of an investigation into Nixon's taxes was given to the House Tax Committee at the beginning of April. Chairing that committee was Wilbur Mills, a Democrat from Arkansas. He spoke of the report's possible effect on the president.
I don't know that I could have taken all that the president's taken up to this point. And I do think that it may intensify pressure from within his own party between now and the election.
Members of the tax committee met with the president, and later, committee member Russell Long announced,
because of the president's decision to pay the deficiencies, the Joint Committee on Internal Revenue and Taxation has decided to conclude its examination of the president's returns.
Since the tax assessment of nearly $500,000 would seriously deplete the president's personal wealth, many of his admirers rallied to his support. One of those was Martin Doer of Whitesburg, Kentucky.
Well, a group of people were having luncheon at the coffee house in Whitesburg, Kentucky yesterday discussing President Nixon's tax dilemma. And I mentioned that I'd like to send a check to help him pay his back taxes that he owes. But before I got my check written, there were several people waiting in line to write checks so they could help the president. Now, these checks were forwarded to the president this morning.
The House Judiciary Committee laid out a tentative schedule. It planned to start hearings in May with a vote by July. Representative Charles Sandman, a New Jersey Republican, was not happy with the pace.
I don't want to be disrespectful to the authority of the chairman, but when are we going to vote on something on this committee? When is this committee going to do something? I've been asking this question.
Peter Rodino, who chaired the committee, answered.
I would hope that the gentleman wants to vote on this when he has a thorough and complete report from the staff, when the White House has supplied to us the pertinent information, the relevant information.
The committee was becoming impatient with stalling and delays in trying to get evidence from the White House. On April 11th, it issued a subpoena for 42 tapes of presidential conversations. Ronald Ziegler, the White House press secretary, spoke for the president.
We have said today in the briefing that we will have an answer to today's communication and other requests for the committee by the end of the Easter vacation. And that answer will be comprehensive and conclusive in terms of the president's actions.
Politicians of both parties were concerned, for different reasons, about the effect of the president's actions on the fall elections. J. Robert Traxler, a Democrat running in Michigan's 8th District for a traditionally Republican seat.
The Republican Party, who really hold the fate of Richard Nixon in their hands, those Republican congressmen can't help but begin to move rather aggressively to take the necessary steps to remove him from the White House, because their political highs are next in November, and they're not going into those November elections with that albatross hung around their neck.
And his Republican opponent in that race, James Sparling.
The only interest now is picking a congressman who might serve this district for the next 8 or 10 years, and who will be the best man.
Sparling lost. Vice President Ford was realistic.
For reasons beyond our control, Watergate and all its ramifications is having an impact on this election year.
One small victory for the Republicans in an otherwise unrelieved series of convictions for those involved in Watergate-related crimes was the acquittal in New York of John Mitchell and Maurice Stans on conspiracy charges. John Mitchell.
Needless to say, we just feel fine. It all was in the hands and was decided by 12 good American people, part of the cross-section of all of America. And that is why I think we can all be proud of the way it works, that people have good sense, good reason, they apply it in the right circumstances, and that's why I love America so much, because there's so many Americans like that in it.
On Monday evening, April 29th, President Nixon went on a nationwide broadcast.
Good evening. I have asked for this time tonight in order to announce my answer to the House Judiciary Committee's subpoena for additional Watergate tapes. There have been allegations and insinuations that I knew about the planning of the Watergate break-in and that I was involved in an extensive plot to cover it up. In these folders that you see over here on my left are more than 1,200 pages of transcripts of private conversations I participated in. In these transcripts, portions not relevant to my knowledge or actions with regard to Watergate are not included. But everything that is relevant is included. The rough as well as the smooth. The strategy sessions, the exploration of alternatives, the weighing of human and political costs. I realize that these transcripts will provide grist for many sensational stories in the press. Parts will seem to be contradictory with one another, and parts will be in conflict with some of the testimony given in the Senate Watergate Committee hearings. To anyone who reads his way through this mass of materials I have provided, it will be totally, abundantly clear that as far as the President's role with regard to Watergate is concerned, the entire story is there.
The House Judiciary Committee was not satisfied with edited transcripts. Peter Odino, chair of the committee.
Well, the failure on the part of the President to comply with the subpoena demonstrates clearly that the President is not cognizant or does not recognize the authority of the House of Representatives to make this inquiry, and that he himself is going to make the determination as to what information is relevant. And this committee cannot go forward that way. And therefore, in my judgment, it would be considered on the part of the members of the committee as a refusal on the part of the President to comply, and the committee members could consider this as a grounds for impeachment.
James St. Clair, the President's lawyer, thought the transcripts were sufficient.
I've just returned from Mr. Doerr's office, and I advised him that the President has directed me to inform the committee through him that the President respectfully declines to produce any more Watergate tapes for the committee's use.
The transcripts in book form became an instant bestseller. They revealed that President Nixon, who had expressed shock at the profanity in the film Love Story, apparently had used equally vulgar language himself. Republican Representative John Rhodes commented.
The transcripts do seem to reveal the fact that there was certainly some language used which was not found in any reputable dictionary.
But Father John McLaughlin, a Jesuit priest hired by the White House to write speeches, answered critics of Nixon's double standard of language.
I see the profanities as a form of emotional drainage. I'm sure I don't have to impress upon you, gentlemen, what the pressure is like at the top. And this form of therapy is not only understandable, but I think, if looked at closely, good, valid, sound.
Father McLaughlin felt Nixon was a moral man.
I would say that the moral tone of this administration, if you accept my definition of morality, the Pauline, the scriptural definition of morality, is sound and historically will be regarded as great.
The members of the House Judiciary Committee, meanwhile, were preparing to begin their impeachment inquiry. There was a prevailing sense of impartiality, but a few members found it difficult to suspend judgment after the revelations of the Nixon transcripts. Representative John Conyers, a Michigan Democrat, had this comment.
We want to give them due consideration, and if someone can dream up any kind of exculpatory defense, as Mr. St. Clair well might have to do, I'm certainly willing to consider it, but on its face, and all I have are the transcripts, the President won't give me the tapes, it looks like he committed a crime, and it looks like that crime is impeachable beyond any shadow of a doubt.
And Vice President Ford told a group in Charleston, Illinois,
we must ensure that this stain of corruption, which has spread so widely, does not have a chance to spread again in the history of America.
I don't need to stress again the importance of our undertaking and the wisdom, decency, and principle which we must bring to it. We understand our high constitutional responsibility. We will faithfully live up to it.
With that statement by Peter Rodino on May 9, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee began hearing evidence in televised sessions that would result in a vote to impeach the President of the United States. A friend of the President, Charles Beebe Rebozo, had this to say about him the day the hearings opened.
He's done nothing wrong, so there's no reason for him to feel bad, other than public opinion sometimes can be distorted in such a fashion as to even make one wonder about himself.
Within a week after the hearings began, there was more talk in Washington that Nixon should resign. Pennsylvania Republican Senator Richard Schweiker reads from a letter he wrote to the President.
The transcripts show a horrendous discrepancy between the public pronouncements and the private actions of this administration. As a result, a moral decay has begun in our government, which will cause us to lose our young people for a generation to come unless we stop it.
But Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, did not think Nixon would resign.
I advised the President that I certainly expressed the hope that he would not resign, and he said, don't worry, there's no chance of that, whatever.
There were those who felt resignation would be precipitous, such as Democratic Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who earlier had advised resignation.
Under our system of government, any defendant is innocent until he's proved guilty. The President is not even a defendant yet, except in the court of public opinion. And I think that these constitutional processes ought to be allowed to continue, and that the President should not be pressured by demands at this time for his resignation.
With the White House still refusing to honor subpoenas, both from the House Judiciary Committee and the Watergate grand jury, the special prosecutor decided to appeal directly to the Supreme Court for a ruling on whether a claim of executive privilege could be used to withhold possible evidence. James St. Clair felt the case should go first to a court of appeals, but the Supreme Court said it would hear the case. And campaigning in Oregon for the Senate, Wayne Morris, long a political maverick, said,
You don't think that one Richard Nixon is going to welcome me with open arms if I'm sworn into the Senate come next January, because he knows my opposition to his policy, and he knows that I know that from the first time he ever ran for office, against Jerry Voorhees and Helen Gahagan Dulles, then got caught with his illegal wiretaps in his campaign against Pat Brown for governor of California, that the man has always been lacking in integrity.
8 weeks later, Wayne Morris died. Had he lived another 3 weeks, he would have seen the President resign. On March 7th, Charles Colson had been indicted on a charge of obstructing justice for his part in the Ellsberg break-in. At that time, he had said,
The fact is that I am innocent, and I will fight to establish my innocence and to clear my name.
On June 3rd, Colson pleaded guilty to a related crime.
I regret what happened, what I attempted to do to Dr. Ellsberg. It is wrong whether it is done to him, to me, or to others. And not only is it morally right that I plead to this charge, but I fervently hope that this case will serve to prevent similar abuses in the future.
He was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. 2 more men who were close to Nixon were also sentenced in June. Richard Kleindienst, once the Attorney General, was given a suspended sentence for misleading a Senate investigating committee in order to protect the President. Kleindienst was asked why he was so loyal to Nixon.
In life, I think we all have duties to perform. We have judgments to make. We do them. I did mine, and here I am today.
And Herbert W. Kalmbach, once Richard Nixon's personal lawyer, was fined and jailed for illegally raising funds for Nixon. Despite growing displeasure with the President, there were many who continued to support him. A group called the National Citizens Committee for Fair Play to the Presidency held a Citizens Congress in Washington to show their feelings for Nixon. His daughter, Tricia Nixon Cox, spoke to the group, as did Nebraska Senator Carl Curtis, a Republican.
Most citizens are aware that the President of the United States has been ruthlessly subjected to a trial by press.
Curtis's opinion of the press was echoed by the President.
What we say here will probably be little noted by the media. But what you have But what you have done here and throughout the United States will be long remembered, not only by the president, but by all future presidents for whom you are working.
It was revealed early in June that part of the evidence sealed by Judge Sirica and turned over in March to the House Judiciary Committee for its later use included the fact that the grand jury had named Richard Nixon a co-conspirator in the Watergate cover-up without indicting him. Representative Barbara Jordan of Texas, a Democratic member of the House committee, had this response.
That revelation will not have any direct effect on the deliberations of the House Judiciary Committee.
James St. Clair was optimistic in the face of the revelation.
Of course, he's not a co-conspirator, sir, only because the grand jury says he is. You know, you have to keep in mind that people are innocent until they're proven guilty, you know?
The Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, otherwise known as the Senate Watergate Committee, was formally dissolved at the end of June. Senator Howard Baker, a Tennessee Republican, spoke for the committee's sense of fairness.
I think that we will end up with a clear and concise statement of the facts, and where the facts conflict, we'll set out the conflicting testimony. But I would be rather surprised if we tried to establish guilt or innocence.
Another member of the committee, Lowell Weicker, a Connecticut Republican, issued his own personal 146-page report, highly critical of Nixon.
Several years ago, many Americans were willing to silently tolerate illegal government activity against militants, terrorists, or subversives as an expeditious way to circumvent the precise processes of our justice system. Though quick, it also proved to be only a short step to using such illegal tactics against any dissenting Americans. And the result was we almost lost America, not to subversives, terrorists, or extremists of the streets, but to subversives, terrorists, and extremists of the White House.
In July, John Ehrlichman, once one of President Nixon's closest personal advisors, was found guilty, along with G. Gordon Liddy, Bernard Barker, and Eugenio Martinez, in the Ellsberg break-in conspiracy case. Here's Ehrlichman.
I have for many years had an abiding confidence in the American judicial system. Nothing that has happened today has in any way shaken that confidence.
Later in July, Ehrlichman was sentenced by Judge Gerhard Gesell to serve between 20 months and 5 years for what the judge called a shameful episode in the history of this country. On July 24th, the Supreme Court, Justice Rehnquist having disqualified himself, ruled 8-0 that President Nixon must obey subpoenas from the special prosecutor and the House Judiciary Committee. The White House said it would begin turning over the tapes and documents by the end of July. Public sentiment for impeachment was growing. Vice President Ford.
The jury, in this case, the House of Representatives, has to have the broadest possible view and has to look at all of the evidence. And when they do, they can't help but come to the conclusion that the president was not involved in any cover-up.
Howard Phillips, a former director of the Office of Economic Opportunity.
I would be prepared, if I were a member of Congress, to vote for some articles of impeachment.
But there remain stout defenders of Nixon. Republican Representative Charles Sandman of New Jersey, for one.
I just can't imagine what else some of these people here want to do to Richard Nixon. They want to throw him out of office for some of the most vague circumstances anybody ever heard of. And then they adopted Article 3. That impeaches him because he won't confess. They had no evidence, and if you don't give me the evidence, then we're going to impeach you. That's a new one. And then, of course, the insult of them all, Article 4. They're going to throw him out because he ended the war by bombing Cambodia. Anybody else would get a prize, but this man was going to get impeached because he ended a war that the two predecessors couldn't end. And now, that's not good enough. They want to strip him of every asset that he's got left, possibly make him go to jail for the rest of his life. Boy, this is a generous crowd.
And a poll released at the end of July reported 51% of the nation favored impeachment. By the 1st of August, the House Judiciary Committee had voted to recommend that the House of Representatives impeach the president. It gave the House 3 articles of impeachment, and Speaker Carl Albert met with key House members to lay the ground rules for impeachment. On August 3rd, a group of men who had given strong financial backing to Nixon reportedly informed him that if he was convicted by the Senate rather than resign, he could lose more than $150,000 a year in benefits, and if widowed, his wife could lose $20,000 a year. The next day, Nixon summoned James St. Clair, other aides, and speechwriters to Camp David. The day after that, August 5th, he released transcripts of conversations in which he clearly attempted to stop the investigation of the Watergate break-in. Representative Charles Sandman of New Jersey, who was to lose in the fall elections.
I can see no escape from this particular information. There is no question in my mind that it represents clearly a violation of the law.
With this revelation, and the House almost certain to vote impeachment, there was much discussion in Washington of Nixon's alternatives. Charles Wiggins, a Republican representative from California, once one of Nixon's strongest defenders.
After considerable reflection, I have reached the painful conclusion that the President of the United States should resign.
On August 6th, Nixon told his cabinet he would not resign. On August 7th, three leading Republicans, Hugh Scott, Barry Goldwater, and John Rhodes, met with Nixon, who said he'd keep the question of resignation open. Vice President Ford said he was prepared to take over. Senator Goldwater estimated that only 15 senators would find Nixon innocent in a Senate trial. The Wall Street Journal recommended that he resign. The next day, August 8th, Ronald Ziegler, Nixon's press secretary, summoned reporters to the White House and announced,
"This has, of course, not been has been a difficult time. The President of the United States will meet various members of the bipartisan leadership of Congress here at the White House early this evening. Tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, the President of the United States will address the nation on radio and television from his Oval Office."
Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you the President of the United States.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
After the broadcast, Senator Hugh Scott, a Pennsylvania Republican, said,
"The country has been on the verge of a nervous breakdown long enough. The President's decision is in the national interest and now opens the way to a healing and mending process under President Ford."
Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States at noon on August 9th. He was the first president to serve who had not been elected. Ford named Gerald Horst as his press secretary, and the next day Horst said that Ford was not likely to pardon Nixon, since Ford had said at his confirmation hearings that the public would not stand for a pardon. And at his first news conference on August 28th, the new president said,
"In this situation, I am the final authority. There have been no charges made. There has been no action by the courts. There's been no action by any jury. And until any legal process has been undertaken, I think it's unwise and untimely for me to make any commitment.
11 days later, former President Nixon reportedly played 18 holes of golf in the rain at his San Clemente estate. And the following day, September 8th, 1 month after his resignation, he was pardoned by President Ford.
My conscience tells me clearly and certainly that I cannot prolong the bad dreams that continue to reopen a chapter that is closed. My conscience tells me that only I, as president, have the constitutional power to firmly shut and seal this book. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
Within 10 minutes of his pardon, Nixon sent Ford a message from San Clemente which read in part that he felt regret and pain at the anguish his mistakes over Watergate had caused the nation and the presidency. There was an outcry in Washington and the nation at large at Ford's pardon. Gerald Hearst, who had been Ford's press secretary for just a month, resigned in protest. Much of the reaction was negative. Representative Elizabeth Holtzman, a Democrat.
We still seem to be seeing a continuation of what we saw in the Nixon administration, which was shielding people from legal accountability and from the criminal justice system because of their high place and their status.
Another Democrat, Representative Charles Rangel.
I think that this has been a shocking blow to our criminal justice system in this country, and that President Ford really has taken that final step in the Watergate cover-up.
But some, either still proud of Nixon or in loyalty to Ford, praised the pardon. Republican Senator Robert Griffin.
President Ford has made the toughest decision of his administration so far. I think he's demonstrated that he has courage as well as compassion. It really would be better, rather than second-guessing him for political reasons now, for the country and the Congress to get about the business of dealing with our other urgent problems.
Later, Mr. Ford gave this testimony before a Senate committee investigating the pardon.
In summary, Mr. Chairman, I assure you that there was never at any time any agreement whatsoever concerning a pardon to Mr. Nixon if he were to resign and I were to become president.
At the end of August, the former president had been served with subpoenas to appear as a witness in the Watergate cover-up trial and to give a deposition in a civil suit, which was later dropped. But by September 12th, 4 days after his pardon, Mr. Nixon's phlebitis, which had troubled him during his trip to Moscow, began to worsen. For this reason, he declined to obey the subpoenas. By the end of September, Nixon was hospitalized for phlebitis. Some senators, hearing that Nixon would be given $850,000 for his transition to civilian life, felt that was too much and cut it by more than two-thirds. Senator Charles Mathias, a Maryland Republican, commented.
The president has received the $100,000 for transitional, really $105 now, and $40 for office staff and space, and $55 for his pension. So we feel that he has been given everything he was entitled to by law, and really not a penny more.
Nixon was able to raise some money by selling the paperback rights to his memoirs. Perhaps to avoid being disbarred, he also sought to resign from the New York and California bar associations. When he resigned from the presidency, Nixon was promised that his White House tapes would be given to him. That agreement was not satisfactory to the many people who were still trying to find out what happened at the White House. One of those was Bernard Fensterwald, James McCord's attorney. He was asked why he wanted Nixon's agreement nullified in court.
Possible problems. One is that the tapes might leave the District of Columbia and be taken to California and put under lock and key under Mr. Nixon's custody, and I think we would have the greatest difficulty in either civil or criminal litigation ever getting them back again. Secondly, there's a provision in the agreement that upon President Nixon's death, the tapes would be destroyed. Unfortunately, he's very ill with phlebitis, which can, and on occasion is, a fatal disease.
The Senate, for its part, directed the White House to retain custody of the tapes and documents. The Watergate cover-up trial of John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Kenneth Parkinson, and Robert Mardian began on October 1st. Mary Louise Smith, named by President Ford to chair the Republican Party, was asked what impact the trial would have on the party in the fall.
Well, the Watergate issue certainly hasn't disappeared and won't for a while. All those things are still with us.
The elections were to prove disastrous for Republicans. Leon Jaworski announced his resignation as special prosecutor as of October 25th. Senator Walter Mondale commented.
He took on really the most crucial law case in American history, which raised the issue of whether the President of the United States had to obey the law like the rest of us or not, and he won it. I would like to see him stay, but I certainly understand his feeling that he's done the key work and can now go home.
As the cover-up trial got underway, the jury and spectators heard some of the tapes which the Supreme Court had ordered the White House to turn over. Gene Packard, Luis DeCepio, and other spectators comment on what they heard in the tapes.
It was fascinating to me how the country could be run like this.
It showed the former president to be what he really was, a crook.
I was very disillusioned to see all those men who really should have been so good planning all those really morally wrong things.
Listening to the entire proceedings this morning, especially the tapes, was like listening to a nightmare. It's one thing to read about what you have heard about so much, but another thing to actually hear it with your own ears. And it was horrifying that I could see that people would spend so much time openly talking about such horrid things that have happened.
It was much more shocking and disgusting to me to actually hear the voices of the President and Mr. Haldeman declaring war on the press and anybody else that got in their way for their personal goals.
The Watergate trial jurors felt, too, that the tapes showed a conspiracy to cover up. And on January 1st, 1975, they found John N. Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, John D. Ehrlichman, and Robert Mardian guilty of all charges against them. Kenneth Parkinson was found innocent. He and Maurice Stans were the only people to be acquitted in the more than 60 cases against individuals and corporations arising out of the Watergate burglary, the break-in at Ellsberg psychiatrist's office, and illegal contributions to Nixon's re-election campaign. John Ehrlichman felt the Watergate jury would not have found him guilty if Richard Nixon had testified at the trial.
I felt strongly, and my attorneys advised me very plainly, that Mr. Nixon's testimony was absolutely essential to the establishment of our defense.
H.R. Haldeman, too, reaffirmed his innocence.
I know that legally and morally I am totally innocent of each of the charges that's been brought here. I intend to move ahead in the days ahead on the process of appeal within the judicial system.
At the end of the year, the most incriminating evidence was still the White House tapes. Litigation in the courts could result in those tapes being released to the public as a unique historical document. They reveal, according to those who heard them, a private Nixon quite different from his public posture. A rare glimpse into the psyche of the man around whom the nation's elemental sense of law and morality was churning for more than 2 years came when he bid farewell to his staff in the East Room of the White House on August 9, 1974, the day after his resignation. Let this, then, be, in Richard Nixon's words, the epilogue to the story of Watergate.
Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint. Now, however, we look to the future. Had a little quote in a speech last night from T.R. As you know, I kind of like to read books. I'm not educated, but I do read books. And the T.R. quote was a pretty good one. There's another one I found as I was reading my last night in the White House. And this quote is about a young man. He was a young lawyer in New York. He'd married a beautiful girl. And they had a lovely daughter. And then suddenly, she died. And this is what he wrote. This was in his diary. He said, "She was beautiful in face and form, and lovelier still in spirit. As a flower she grew, and as a fair young flower she died. Her life had been always in the sunshine. There had never come to her a single great sorrow. None ever knew her who did not love and revere her for her bright and sunny temper and her saintly unselfishness. Fair, pure, and joyous as a maiden, loving, tender, and happy as a young wife. When she had just become a mother, when her life seemed to be just begun, and then the years seemed so bright before her, then by a strange and terrible fate, death came to her. And when my heart's dearest died, the light went from my life forever." That was T.R. in his 20s. He thought the life had gone from his life forever, but he went on. And he not only became president, but as an ex-president, he served his country always in the arena, tempestuous, strong, sometimes wrong, sometimes right, but he was a man. And as I leave, let me say, that's an example I think all of us should remember. We think sometimes when things happen that don't go the right way, we think that when you don't pass the bar exam the first time, I happened to, but I was just lucky. I mean, my writing was so poor, the bar examiner said, "We just got to let the guy through." We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as T.R. said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.